So the gender gap in pay is continuing. Why aren't we making more progress on it? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So it's discouraging to all of us who've been arguing that we need to narrow the gender pay gap to see headlines like this, stating that the gender pay gap has barely budged in the last 2 decades. Or how about this one, that the gender pay gap actually cost the world economy $7 trillion. That's because of lost income and lost productivity. Well, I can tell you, as someone who studied economics, that many economists will tell you the whole issue of the gender gap is overblown. Why is that? Because economists will engage in sophisticated statistical analysis of data, something we call econometrics. And using these types of calculations, we can isolate the effect of certain factors. So what economists have done is that they've looked at the gender gap in pay and then done what we call control for certain other factors. Those would be things like who takes time off to care for children and elderly relatives, who will have gaps in their employment, who will work more hours. And once you control for these factors and others, unbelievably, the gender gap suddenly disappears. And that makes sense because at this point, for a company to have 2 people working the same job, one a man and one a woman, with the man earning more money than the woman, is patently illegal and is frankly pretty much unacceptable in society as a whole. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the days when it was common for employers to say things like, oh, the man should earn more money because he has to take care of his family. Fortunately, those days are behind us. But that doesn't mean that the pay gap has disappeared. So should we just kind of throw up our hands and say, oh, I guess we can't do anything about it? Well, to that I would answer no. The gender gap is a real and persistent problem that can be resolved. You see, here's the thing. We have built into our system expectations that result in women typically being the child care provider and the provider of care for elderly relatives and the one who has to take time off when the kids are off from school and the one who is expected to have a break in her employment because the kids are young. Even today, the idea of a man doing all those things, frankly, is kind of frowned upon. And we've built certain institutions into our system that support this perception. I mean, I don't need to lecture any working mother about the difficulty in obtaining good childcare. How about universal pre-K for children, too? These are fundamental things that would make it easier for women to stay in the workforce and not have this burden of having to take time off that then hurts their career and ends up damaging their long-term earnings. I mean, let me give you an example here. Here is a graph that details the relative pay for different kinds of specialists in medicine. Now, the highest paid specialists tend to be plastic surgeon, orthopedic surgeon, cardiologists, ENT doctors known as otolaryngologists, urologists, gastroenterologists. And the lowest paid tend to be, aside from public health and preventive medicine, pediatrics, family medicine, diabetes and endocrinology, psychiatry. The highest paid specialties tend to be dominated by men, while the lowest paid tend to be dominated by women. Now, if you point that out to somebody and say, oh, this results in a gender pay gap among medical doctors, they would say, well, it's because women pick the specialties that tend to pay less. And the way our system is set up, physicians bill by complex procedures. And these other specialties that tend to be dominated by men tend to do more complex procedures than the other specialties that are dominated by women. And to that I would respond, that's true, but that's the point. We have these institutions that are set up in a way that are going to result in men being paid more than women. The fields that women will naturally gravitate towards, and that tend to be more accepting of things like family obligations that frequently fall on the shoulders of women, will tend to be the ones that are lower paid. Whereas the ones that lionize working long hours, neglecting your family and friends, and never taking any time off, well, those specialties will tend to be male-dominated and will tend to earn more money. Could we set up a system in which primary care physicians, who tend to be more female, are paid as much as the surgeons, and where surgeons are allowed to live a life with a good work-life balance? Of course we could, but we've chosen not to because it fits the narrative that we have that men are paid more than women. And because of the fact that they're doing different jobs, well, that makes it acceptable then to pay the women less. And we just kind of throw up our hands and say, oh, well, I guess this gender pay gap is simply an artifact of just the way things are. But I would submit to you, things don't have to be that way. That instead, these reflect choices that we've made as a society. Choices that inevitably result in men earning more money than women on average. Thus, you have a gender pay gap. And until we start to address these institutional systems that are set up in a way that it benefits the pay of men at the expense of women, until we start to address those institutions, we will continue to have this kind of problem. Well, if you want to see a video where I talk about how Fox News essentially told women to sit down and shut up, check out this video over here. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.